All right, so everything is rolling. It's rolling. Damon, good to have you in the
Eric,
studio.
I'm so glad to be here.
We're going live with this, right? Well, not really going live. I say going live, but we're not actually live.
Live on tape.
But yeah, there we go.
Yes.
That's a better way to describe it.
Yes.
I'm glad to have you in.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
We're going to be talking about some good stuff today.
I hope so.
Very important stuff
I hope so.
that I think the audience needs to know. They need to learn about it if they don't know
Okay.
about it. So why don't you introduce yourself?
Mhm.
Tell our audience a little bit about yourself and what you do, and then we can go from there.
Well, my name is Damon L. Jacobs, and I
Yes,
say please
I forgot
remember
to say
the L,
that. But
because if you just Google Damon Jacobs, there may be some unsavory characters
Yes.
who come up who are
I-
not me.
speaking of that, I have that with my name. People will Google mine, and like the first thing that comes up is like a murder case in Miami.
Mine
With
is
a
serial
football
rapist
player.
in New York City.
There we
So
go. Okay, all right, there we go.
Please include the L because
Yes.
I am not a serial rapist in New York
It's
City.
very important to get the right name.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
so go ahead.
Yes, this is why I think a lot of us in the digital age are using our middle names or middle
Yes,
initials.
I use W, my middle
What is
name
your-
too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Eric, so Damon L. Jacobs.
Yes.
I am a
Mm.
licensed marriage and family therapist here in New York State as well as in the state of California. And a lot
Coast to coast.
coast to coast,
There you go.
both like blue states,
Yes.
kind of those bubbles.
Yeah.
But a lot of
much.
the work that I've always done or always been interested in doing or
Just
been
adjust
involved
your
with.
mic for you real quick.
Sure.
Want to make sure that we
Mic.
get your audio because
Yeah.
the worst is not hearing our guests. That would be the worst thing.
Oh, I project.
There we go.
I know how to project, baby.
Excellent.
I know how to use a diaphragm.
We like projection from our guests.
Okay.
All right.
My interests really, even though has always been about psychology. And
Mhm.
honestly, when I say always, I mean from the age of 5, I've always wanted to
Wow.
be a psychotherapist.
Okay.
Ever since Marlena Evans debuted on Days of Our Lives in 1976.
Oh man.
I remember like seeing her character
Mhm.
and she was beautiful and she was gorgeous and she had a hot boyfriend. And I just like the characters would come into her office and she'd
Mhm.
help them feel better. And I remember saying to my mom, like, that is what I want to do.
Wow.
So I've always wanted to be a therapist and always wanted to be a psychotherapist and help people.
Mhm.
But as I got older and as I went through school, I found that what I thought psychology was lacking
hmm
was in the role of social activism in the field. And usually we talk about politics and we talk about
Yeah.
psychology. We're talking about two different areas.
hmm
And in my mind and in my spirit, they're very intertwined.
Yeah.
That you really can't have one without the other, or you can, but you're missing a lot.
Yes.
So a lot of my early education, undergraduate and graduate school, was in the 1990s in San Francisco, and that was smack in the middle of the AIDS crisis.
Okay.
So people were coming into the clinic not because they necessarily had these pressing issues with their mother or their father or their dead dog Rover,
Rover, what a name.
but they really needed to talk and process through the devastation, the systemic genocide, devastation of the AIDS crisis and the
I could
absence
imagine.
in the U.S. of any reaction to that whatsoever as people watched their loved ones and their friends and lovers die
Yeah.
in a system that really didn't exhibit much care or compassion
Mhm.
about that. And those were the issues
Yeah.
that people needed to work through and wanted to work through. And it seemed to me that if I was serious about being a therapist
Mhm.
or playing any kind of role in trying to help this world, it meant not just sitting in a clinic all day and hoping people would come in, but it meant like being out there in the field.
Being active and
Act
going
up,
out
fight
there.
back, talking about HIV, talking about
Yeah.
AIDS, helping people learn the facts about HIV and AIDS, and learn how to prevent HIV and AIDS.
Yeah. Even now, we need more people like that because there's so much out there that people don't know, don't want to talk about, and we need people like you to go out and just tell people exactly what's going on, what they can do to prevent it, what they could do to help themselves when they, need that,
Yeah. And I think that it's always like knowledge is power. And it's a
Mhm.
cliche, but I think it's true.
No, it's very
Knowledge is
true.
empowerment, whether someone's sexually active or not, whether they're at risk
Mhm.
for HIV or not, whether they have HIV or not.
Mhm.
Just knowledge of how sexual health can be improved, especially given all the advances we have today.
Absolutely.
And now there's quite a few
Yeah.
that we're going to be talking about, but
Mhm.
just for people to know that. Because even if it's not for them, they may have a friend or
Yes.
a loved one or a family member who
That
could
is a
really
very
benefit
good
from
point.
this.
Because for myself, like I haven't had much, experience with it, but I know that there are other people that I know who, could use the information. So that's one of the main reasons why I wanted you to come on the show, because some people watching this could say, oh, hey, I didn't know any of this before, and I really needed to know this. So
Right.
now that you're here, you can tell everybody about everything.
So we're gonna save the world tonight. That's
Yes,
what we're gonna do.
that's what it is. Even if we don't, it's a start
it's-
here. So
yeah.
hey, so fast forward, you've been working in HIV prevention for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
but when was your first? Because we're gonna talk about PrEP,
Mm-hmm.
which is pre-exposure prophylaxis.
Mm-hmm.
I think I said
Rolls
that
right
right.
off your tongue.
There we go.
Yeah.
Maybe not, but so what was your first exposure with it? And also tell the audience what exactly that is.
Sure. So PrEP, as you said, stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. That means it's a daily pill that someone who is HIV negative would take if they are at risk of acquiring HIV, either through sexual contact or through IV drug use. And some people don't know that this exists, but this was actually approved by the FDA in the United States. This was approved back in July of 2012, nearly 6 years ago. This was the very first
time flies.
strategy.
It feels like it feels like yesterday almost.
But this was the very first strategy the FDA ever approved for HIV prevention in this country. And yes, I mean what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Because people are like, well, we've always had condoms.
Mm-hmm.
When did the FDA approve condoms to be used for HIV prevention? Never. They've never been approved for use. Now, we know that they work well when they're used,
Absolutely.
and there is logic and reasoning behind their use. I'm not saying they're wrong or bad. But what I am saying is that we've never had the scientific validation to show that they do work.
Yeah.
And the one or two studies we have about condom efficacy is not, puts them somewhere in the 70% range. But PrEP had science, and has even more science now than it did 6 years ago, to show that daily use of this pill prevents HIV by more than 99%, probably greater to 100%.
That's amazing.
It is a phenomenal drug. And when I think back of how many people I lost to the AIDS epidemic and how many people wish they had known about this. I mean, can you imagine if we could go back 30 years and offer people a pill to prevent AIDS back in 1988? How many people would still be with us today?
It's actually interesting. I don't know if you watched on FX. They had the assassination of Gianni Versace. I don't know if you saw that.
I haven't, but I've heard about it. Yeah.
Well, so since you haven't, I won't spoil anything that they
know the story, but
really. We know the real story, but in one of the episodes, there was an episode talking about the HIV epidemic, AIDS epidemic, everything like that, and how at the time people were discovering treatments for it. And so it's weird because I looked back, I was watching it and I looked back at the time and I said, wow, back at that time, there was like a lot of people felt very, hopeless at the time. Like there was no hope if you had it. And then if you didn't have it, it's like, how do you prevent yourself from getting this? And, now fast forward all these years and we have something like PrEP to actually prevent HIV. It's amazing what we can come up with in a relatively short amount of time.
It really is. It's this idea that someone now has full control over their sexual health. And I'm just going to be clear what I mean by that, because I can be clear with you.
Be as clear as you want.
Wendy's not listening. This is the first time that the receptive partner can control their HIV status, the bottom, the person who enjoys receiving anal sex or vaginal sex. This is the first time the receptive partner has had full control over their HIV status. Up until PrEP, it was always contingent on the insertive partner. Or the top to wear a condom. And make sure that condom didn't break. Or fall off, or fall in, or whatever condoms sometimes go astray.
Or make sure there's no funny business.
Yeah.
Actually, I've heard stories recently about how there are men going around that are actually poking holes in condoms.
I've always heard those things.
I don't know how true it is. I've just heard recently that.
But let's just say that's true. Let's just say that's absolutely the fact. Even if that's the fact on PrEP, who cares?
Yeah.
I mean, even with PrEP, you would not. One of the consequences if that happens to you. Would not be that you would get HIV. You would not get HIV if you're taking PrEP as prescribed and having receptive sex. So this is the first time in my life I started using this July 19th, 2011.
Okay.
And
so it's been about 7 years?
Almost 7 years.
Almost. This year it'll be the 7 year.
2018 will be 7 years.
7 year anniversary.
7 year, I've been itching. 7 year itching.
7's not that special number, but hey, let's celebrate it anyway.
And it's just been amazing to me. It's not just sexual. It's emotionally and psychologically the first time in my life that I have had control over whether or not HIV enters my body.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, it's like I grew up in the 80s. I remember noticing that I was attracted to men right around the same time that Rock Hudson was a very famous celebrity. And he, in the summer of 1985, he was this 50s Hollywood heartthrob, but his body was being ravished by AIDS, and the media just exploited him for it was disgusting. But in my mind, I was like, oh, you can't be gay because if you do anything with guys, that's going to be you someday. If you have sex and you enjoy sex, you're going to die, like Rock Hudson. And in my mind and my synapses, pleasure and punishment were inevitably linked after that. They always went together until PrEP, until I started using PrEP. And I started to be able to unpack kind of these 2 decades of this ongoing, never-ending trauma that I had worked with personally and professionally, that I had lost so many people to, that my clients had lost so many people to, and to really begin to work and heal from that.
And, it's crazy, as you say that, for somebody like myself, I'm a straight male. So to hear, stories like that about how you, associate, death with, pleasure, I guess.
Yeah.
It's crazy to hear that. It's crazy to hear that people went through that, because I can't really relate to it. Like, I can't relate to the fact that, just having sex, not that it is a death sentence or anything like that, but that people thought of it. Oh, I'm like stumbling with my words here, that people thought of it like that. Like, almost, oh, hey, if I do this, oh my goodness, I'm at risk for this, and
that was the
crazy.
Reality. I mean, I first moved to San Francisco in 1990. And I can still, as clear as I see you right now, I can remember walking down Castro Street and seeing young men with oxygen tanks and canes and sunken faces, looking like when that afternoon fog blows over, they could just fall over.
That's crazy.
And they're all gone. And that was, I mean, the whole community at that time was still just reeling from the first wave of so many people losing their entire community. It's just something... Even someone who was there who came into that late in 1990, I still can't imagine what that would have been like. To suddenly your friends within a year are all dead, and your time is spent occupying funerals. So I'm glad you don't ever have to know that. I'm glad that a lot of people, especially people under 30, don't have to know that. And it's really, I want to say, a testament so much to the work of so many people who... I want to just acknowledge this.
Absolutely.
On Instagram, this is the AIDS Memorial. This is kind of an electronic tribute to so many long-term survivors of people and people who passed away. It's kind of an electronic AIDS quilt. So that anybody who has a memory of someone who died from AIDS or has passed away from HIV or wants to acknowledge a long-term survivor who paved the way so that we can not have those experiences, can go to the AIDS Memorial and get one of these T-shirts and, acknowledge, like, the history that has led us to be here today.
That's really cool. So question, what was your first exposure to PrEP? Like, what was the first moment that it, like, struck you, like, I got to use this?
So for me, some of this, it was a very interesting timing thing. I was working in vaccine research at the time for an organization here in New York City. And so I was doing outreach and education in bars and clubs and streets in New York City and Brooklyn. And, when you do that, you kind of have to know about HIV prevention because people are going to ask you questions.
Yeah.
So we're going around the city, and we're doing this throughout 2009 and 2010. And this was right around the time that, for me, a long-term relationship was coming to an end. That a 7-year relationship, about 7 years, was coming to an end. And I was starting to get out into the cruising world, the dating world in New York City. And I can tell you, Eric, if anyone believed that people were using condoms then, it was pretty rare. Even back then, a lot of gay or same-gender loving men had already stopped using condoms in their sexual encounters. And for the first time in my life, I found myself having encounters, sexual encounters that did not involve condoms. and kind of having what we call in therapy a lot of cognitive dissonance about that. Because here I am, I'm a therapist, I'm supposed to know better.
Yeah.
And I'm a good gay, right?
I'm
an educator, I'm a
good
therapist,
gay.
I know these things, but I am doing things that are putting myself in direct way of HIV.
Yeah.
It was also the same time I was turning 40 years old, and there was a part of me that was saying, will I ever, in my life, will I ever get a chance to experience sex without the fear of HIV? I mean, remember, this all started when I was like 13, 14. So by the time I'm 40 and there's no end to this, and I'm starting to think, is there ever going to be a day in my lifetime when I can experience connection and intimacy and pleasure without HIV hovering over me?
Having to worry about that.
And a part of my brain said, yeah, Damon, there's one way to do that. When you become positive, you don't have to worry about being positive anymore. And that might sound really nuts to you and to some people listening and watching this, but I got to tell you, for those who work in therapy or in the social work field, that is not uncommon for people who have been living under the shadow of fear of HIV over the long term. It's exhaustion, it's fatigue, it's this never-ending wondering, when is this ever going to happen?
So it's almost like you're giving in at a certain point.
It's kind of this like
it's
ongoing
almost like, well,
learned hope. I mean, the therapeutic term would kind of be a form of learned hopelessness, where when something feels like an inevitability, that after a while you just kind of want to get it over with. And so I was starting to notice that I was having those kinds of thoughts.
Wow.
And I was also very aware that these were similar to many of the thoughts that had been described to me by colleagues and friends and clients who had acquired HIV.
Wow.
And it was around this time then, in the summer of 2011, again, part of my job was learning about the research, and GMHC, Gay Men's Health Crisis in Chelsea, was having a summit, a meeting about the results of something called the PrEP trial. And the PrEP trial was the very first major research trial that showed how well Truvada works when it's used daily. And some of the researchers were there, and they were explaining that nobody who participated in this trial, there were 2,499 participants, nobody in this trial who took Truvada 4 or more days a week acquired HIV. There were 0 infections. Compared and contrasted to the group of people in the study who took the drug 3 or less times a week. There were infections in that group of people, and then half the people were given a placebo. And there were a lot of HIV acquisitions in that study.
Wow.
So what that shows us when you compare and contrast these different groups is that taken 4 or more times a week, Truvada really, really works. And I started to think, wait a second, maybe there is a way for me to defer or delay or prevent HIV altogether, have the kind of sex I want to have, and not get HIV at the same time.
Not have to worry about it.
And I thought, all right, this is the last chance here. And
I mean, it must have also been kind of mind blowing for you to like have that after so many years of that fear, and then eventually like we were talking about, almost giving into it, being like, oh, it's an inevitability. There we go. I'm struggling with some words today. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I was so tired. I was so fucking tired of. Sorry.
No, it's all right.
I can say it.
Go ahead.
So
We say the F word all the time.
Afraid. Or always having that cloud hovering over me.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that to you now. It's not like I understood that at the time. I didn't know that cloud was there. I'm telling you these things that are clear in my conscious now. I wasn't mindful about them. I wasn't conscious of them then. I didn't start to become aware of these thoughts and feelings and experiences until I started using PrEP. And that cloud started to go away.
Yeah.
And I started to feel like, whoa, this is amazing. Like, I am fully in control of my sexual health. I am fully in control of my body for the first time in my adult life. I get to decide whether HIV enters my body or not. This feels amazing. And I started to realize that cloud had been there. That's this inevitable, someday you're going to become positive, someday you're going to become positive. There's really not a cure or a vaccine immediately on the horizon, so eventually this is going to happen to you.
And at the time that you felt that you were feeling that way, did you know about post-exposure prophylaxis as well?
I knew
Was that around
about
at the
but
time?
Honestly, I wasn't that familiar with it, which is weird because I work in vaccine research,
Yeah.
and I really didn't know much about it.
Okay.
I didn't have that information.
Yeah, because that's also something like, people will say, if you feel like you've been exposed, go to the clinic and get post-exposure prophylaxis, which is, I believe, is the same medication, right? It's a Truvada, or is it something different?
If people in New York State, if they get post-exposure prophylaxis, which is PEP, which sounds very similar to PrEP, so
Yeah.
that's confusing, they would want to go to, I think they want to just do HIV PEP in New York City, and immediately there's places all over the state where they could go 24 hours to get PEP. And if they do that, they're going to take, for 28 days, they're going to take a combination of Truvada and most likely another drug called Icentris.
One other. Okay.
So it's a combination of drugs. Now, if I use PrEP by myself, I just use Truvada by itself. It's not a combination of other drugs. It's just one drug that I take every day.
All right.
So it was like a new world, basically.
Yeah.
And it opened up this, again, it wasn't just only about sex, but that was a big part of it. But it also gave me this sense of feeling like I have more control than I'd ever have. Or again, therapeutic term is locus of control, to say that, oh, if I do this every day, I won't get HIV. But I wasn't talking about it back then. I still wasn't telling people about this, mainly because the FDA had not approved it. So my insurance was sort of covering it, but like my doc, I don't exactly know how my insurance was covering it, but they were. But I was afraid if they found out that they would stop paying for it.
Yeah, it's like one of those. It's like a slippery slope. It's like you don't exactly know.
I didn't know how it was getting paid for. I just knew it was. So
it was.
I didn't want to shake the boat, and it was also not my job. It was not my job to talk about PrEP. My job was to talk about vaccines and condoms and try to get people interested in vaccine research.
So, another question. At that time, how hard was it when you found out about PrEP? How hard was it to tell other people about it, like who were in your same situation? Like, were people really receptive to it, or were there people who were kind of like, well, I don't really know about this, Well,
nobody did know about it at the time. So I didn't know anyone else who was on it. And the people I would be hooking up with who would ask about that, I'd have to explain it to them, and it kind of would become this education session. So, which I don't really mind incorporating sex and education. I think it's kind of fun, but sometimes you don't always want to be a teacher.
You don't want to be intimate with somebody and have it turn into a sex ed class.
Right, but it did quite a few times. And a lot of times people simply didn't believe it. They simply didn't believe this was true. Like, I'm not going to say the organization, but I went to a certain liberal organization, political organization's Christmas party at the end of 2013, and I counted 19 people who I spoke with at this progressive organization who had never heard of PrEP before.
Really? Wow.
Ever. And they gave me this look like, you're an alien. Like,
you're an alien.
You're a little crazy boy. Go away. They really had never heard of Truvada or PrEP. I was like, don't believe me. Google's your friend. And, really just Google the facts about Truvada and PrEP, and see what comes up. But the FDA had approved it by that point. And, it's a real thing.
So since you've been taking it, is it considered an antibiotic? Technically,
no. It's considered an antiretroviral.
Okay,
meaning it is something that it was researched and studied and originally approved to treat HIV.
Okay.
So Truvada, the drug, was originally approved in 2004 to be used in combination with other drugs for either PEP, like we said, or to treat HIV.
Okay.
So that people living with HIV could become undetectable and therefore untransmittable, which is another thing I want to say a little more about. But Truvada was then approved for a different indication for prevention in 2012. But it's considered, the classification is an antiretroviral, or otherwise known as an ART.
All right. I also wanted to ask you, do you experience, like, having to take it every day, do you experience any, side effects or anything that maybe is unwanted?
Oh, no, I have side effects, but the side effects I've had are really good sex.
Okay.
And much better sleep at night. Because honestly, I am one of those people that would wake up in the middle of the night covered with night sweats. Feeling my limbs, feeling like, okay, swollen limbs, scanning my skin for freckles, or thinking it's Kaposi's sarcoma, thinking, okay, that's it, I've got AIDS now. I've got HIV.
Did that come from if you had a sexual encounter with somebody, did it come after, or was it just all the time? Even if you hadn't had sex with anybody, you were thinking about something that you did 2 weeks ago. Was it like that, or was it?
It was on a regular basis because, and especially you remember, like in the 90s, we had HIV testing, but they told us that the window period was 6 months.
Oh.
So if you're coming in May to get an HIV test, that's only really going to tell you what was going on back in November.
That's something that
now the tests we have are like really accurate. They're like maybe 14 to 28 days.
That's actually something that's really, that you bring that up. It's actually interesting to me because in reading it, you see so much information about testing windows, and you don't really know what's true. It's not so much that people are lying or giving you wrong information, but it seems like some people are either really conservative or they're really, on the most up-to-date, days. I mean, if you go to, one of the things that I've had an issue with is actually if you go to the city clinics, they technically don't do HIV testing if you've had a HIV test within like 3 months, which to me, I feel like it's kind of weird that they would do that, because I would figure with more up-to-date tests that you wouldn't tell people 3 months. You might say, tests starting at this point and then, maybe check again at this point. But they're like, well, we're not really supposed to.
Did they say why?
They say, like, if you, like, let's say you get a test in January and then you wanted to go back in February, they say, oh, well, we're really not supposed to test you unless it's 3 months away, which is weird to me. It's just like, I don't understand.
That is weird. And I think if someone has knowingly been exposed to HIV, they probably would be willing to do one.
Yeah.
I mean, because part of the protocol of PrEP is that you would do, if you were exposed to HIV or potentially exposed, and you go in and you ask for PrEP, they're going to do an HIV test then, and they're going to likely do one 30 days later.
It's just weird to me because I had a friend who was telling me about this, who was like, she went to the clinic, and when she went to the clinic, she got tested, and then like a month later she went back because she was like, oh, I'm going to get tested like once a month or whatever. I think that's what it was. And she was like, oh, well, the clinic told her that she couldn't do it. She couldn't do like a, what was it? There's anonymous testing and then confidential. So I think they said she had to do it anonymously. She wasn't allowed to do it confidentially.
Here in New York?
Yeah.
Okay, so that doesn't quite jive with what I understand, because we don't have anonymous testing in New York. We have confidential testing. In California, there's anonymous testing.
It's weird. I mean, she had told me that that's the way that it worked for her. So it was just really.
I don't fully know, but I do know that the New York City sexual health departments, and they've kind of rebranded them. They're called sexual health clinics now, as opposed to STD clinics before. And they're really trying to make STD and HIV testing destigmatized. They're really trying to encourage people to say sex is natural, sex is healthy, sex is great, and one of the ways that you can make it better is to take care of your sexual health and come in and get tested for HIV, for sexually transmitted infections, and to sort of remove the barriers and remove the stigma around that. So I don't know what's going on with your friend. I don't know exactly.
Yeah, it was a weird situation, but she swore that was the information that she was given. So yeah, it was weird, but it didn't make sense to me either. But we will have to talk about that a little more.
I mean, especially if she says, I'm at acute risk, or I was just exposed, or I may have just been exposed in the last few weeks.
Maybe it was that. Maybe it was that she knew she wasn't really at risk, but she was just getting tested to like get herself checked. Maybe that's what it was.
So if it was a peace of mind issue, which I completely respect, but if it was just about peace of mind without any acute risk factors, then I can see why they were like, we got to save the taxpayer money here and really.
But even at that point, I mean, the people, unless they're with you 24/7, you don't really know exactly what's going on. Somebody may just not want to talk about exactly. They may just come in and say, well, I don't really know what's going on, even though they know full well what's going on. So it was really weird to me, the whole thing. But
I don't know. We'll have to follow up with her.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Another question. Moving on. I don't mean moving on. That sounded like terrible. Like moving on. Forget that what we just said. But one thing I want to say, we got TT and Truett over here helping out. Appreciate your help, guys. Thank you. Wanted to give them a shout out for helping out. over there.
Yay, TT,
Um,
yay, Truett, yay, Dr. B.
all focused over there on something. I did want to ask, for people taking PrEP, one of the things that I have heard and I've read a couple things about is that there are people who are worried that if people take PrEP, they'll engage in riskier sexual behavior. Do you feel like
You
that?
mean like if you're parked in a car, you'd forget to put on the emergency brake? That kind of risk?
I guess you could put it like that.
No, I'm making a joke because I would say if you are having sex with like near zero chance of getting HIV,
I think people, when I was reading the article, they made it sound more as though people would be at risk for like gonorrhea, chlamydia, those kind of STDs. So do you
those little buggers,
those little effers?
Okay.
So do you feel like that's really the case? Do you feel like people, when they're on PrEP, they kind of forget about those other ones, or is it they're still aware and they're still?
I don't think they forget about them. I think they kind of dismissed them and forgot about them or gave them up a long time ago. So it's important to say that PrEP prevents one thing. It does one thing and only one thing, and it does that one thing very well. It does not do anything to protect anybody from syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, any other thing that we don't want to get. It only protects from HIV. But that question was always out there. It's like, well, if you give people a way to prevent HIV, then they're going to be more at risk for other things. So let's look at that just logically, right? I would say, Eric, what if we could go back 20 years? What if we could go back to 1998 and ask a group of sexually active gay and bisexual men how often they were using condoms then? And honestly ask them and get honest answers. What do you think the actual accuracy would be 20 years ago for how regularly people were using condoms back in 1998?
I don't know. I don't know a number. I would say maybe not that high.
Take a guess.
I don't know, 30%.
Okay, you're close. Although we don't have a time machine, Dr. Don Smith from the CDC did go back and analyze research that came from vaccine trials that were taking place between 1998 and 2001.
Okay.
And in order to be in a vaccine trial, you do have to be fairly sexually active and at risk of acute risk of acquiring HIV.
Yeah.
So she went back and she looked at the forums and she looked at the data, and she found that back between 1998 and 2001, only 16%, 16% of sexually active gay and bisexual men in these trials said that they were using condoms consistently.
Wow.
So, when you look at that, and then you ask the question about, is PrEP going to cause people to have unsafe sex? I think the bareback horse has already left the barn.
Probably.
People have been having bareback sex for billions and billions of years, hence how you and I got here. It's not like something that just started because PrEP. But when straight people do it, we don't call it bareback. And we don't call it risky. And we don't call it unsafe. We just call it sex.
Yeah.
And that's, we don't stigmatize it that way. When it's two men having anal sex without condoms, we tend to use labels like barebacks or unsafe or risky. And I totally get that. I'm not saying that. I understand what 36 years of conditioning of the AIDS crisis has done to our very fragile brains. It's done it to my brain. And I understand how we all are conditioned to see same gender loving anal sex in that frame. But what we do have the opportunity to do now with PrEP and with U equals U is to re-examine these frameworks and rethink sexual health and HIV prevention as something that is healthy, that is wonderful, that is beautiful, that is fun. And within that framework, there are ways to reduce harm. And now the other thing that people need to remember about PrEP specifically is that if you at this moment compared a group of people using PrEP, if you looked at that group of people and you saw how many sexually transmitted infections were being treated and diagnosed, you probably would see a relatively high number. Any idea why? Because we're all just a bunch of like bareback Travada whores? Or is there another logical explanation?
There probably is a logical explanation.
Okay.
Well,
let me ask you.
Yes.
Straight man.
Okay.
How many times has your doctor offered you STI testing in the last year?
None.
How many in the last 2 years?
Well, I've only been to the doctor a handful of times.
Okay.
So,
Has a doctor ever offered
um,
you a test for
you know,
sexually transmitted infections?
what's actually funny is that as I've gotten older,
Uh-huh.
doctors that I've visited have talked to me less about it. When I was a kid,
Mm-hmm.
they talked to me a lot more about it. They said, "Oh, make sure you're doing this." Like when I was like a teenager or whatever, like, "Oh, make sure if you have sex, you're doing this or whatever. Make sure you use a condom, everything." And then like as I got older, it's almost like that conversation just went out, which I've always found that weird. I've always felt like, doctors should know. I mean, I don't think they should like bug you about it, just be like, "Hey, who are you having sex with? What are you doing?" Everything like that. But they should definitely be like, "Hey, do you have any questions about this? Is everything okay?" So as time has gone on, the questions have,
So that is great,
gone.
right? That is such an important point. And medically, this is when I speak about PrEP all over the country, I hear very similar experiences that when we get to be a certain age, we're not seen as sexual by the medical community. And sometimes there's ageism in the community as well,
Yeah.
but it's in the medical community. And especially women are not seen at risk because they're not perceived as sexual beings. Okay, so let's say...
It's weird. It's almost ironic. Because it's almost like if you talk to like a bunch of men, like you have like this group of men that will look at women as only like sexual beings. Unfortunately, there are men out there who are like that. But then when you go to the doctor's office, it's almost like different. It's like, no,
Right.
we don't really look at you as that.
Right.
It's
A lot
weird.
of men perceive women as objects,
Yes.
but then doctors dismiss them as actual healthy sexual beings and don't necessarily think to ask about sexual activity and the different factors that could put a woman at risk of HIV or STIs. So, okay. So now, thanks to PrEP and thanks to the guidelines that are put out by the CDC and the World Health Organization, if a doctor or a provider is following those guidelines, they're going to be doing thorough STI testing 3 to 4 times a year. And when I say thorough, I mean up the butt. I mean rectal swabs.
Yeah, get the real stuff.
And do you know why that's important?
Because people might not even know that they have something.
Right. That if I have rectal gonorrhea and I give my doctor a urine sample, it's not going to show positive for gonorrhea. That's really important. And doctors didn't even realize this till about 12, 13 years ago. The CDC didn't even begin to make any kind of recommendations for anal swabs until about 10 years ago. Now, with PrEP, that's intrinsic in the guidelines. 3-site testing, the throat, the urine, and the butt. And for women, the vagina. Okay? Now, because of PrEP, and all these people saying, "Hey, doctor, I want PrEP, and I want to have, like, sex, and I want to have the option not to use condoms when I'm having sex." You have so many people, and in this country, we have 167,000 people approximately now using Truvada for PrEP.
Okay.
Most of these people have providers who are following the protocol, and they're getting 3-site testing 3 to 4 times a year compared to before when they weren't getting any testing. So another example is like I had a client who was 32 years old, and he wanted to be on PrEP, so he went to a clinic in Lower Manhattan, and he met with the doctor, and he got tested, and the doctor's like, "Okay, great. You're appropriate for PrEP. Here's your prescription, but we're also going to treat you for the anal gonorrhea." He had no idea he had anal gonorrhea.
Wow.
And he had no idea how long he had it, and he had no idea how many people he had given it to.
Wow.
All he knew was because of PrEP, he was finally getting adequate testing, treating.
Yeah.
But when we have adequate testing and treating, we also have adequate documenting. So on paper, it looks like all these little slutty Truvada whores who are running around having all this condomless sex are spreading all these STIs. What we haven't been able to do, and what we can't really do, is compare that relatively to a sample of the population of HIV negative sexually active men who are not in medical care, who are not getting tested, treated, and how many STIs you find in that community. We don't really have a scientific way of doing that, but I will tell you this. I go around the country and I talk to communities about PrEP. And this is almost everywhere that I've gone, even in Canada. I've done the same thing. It's often a group of men who are on PrEP or people who are living with HIV or people who are sexually active. And I say, tell me how many people in this room, just like I just said to you, how many people in this room in the last year have been offered an anal swab by a medical professional? And at this point, I'd say it's usually about 80 to 90% of the people say, yes, I have been offered in the last year. And I say, if we could go back 10 years ago, how many of you in this room who were sexually active 10 years ago were offered an anal swab 10 years ago? silence, or maybe
So,
one. Maybe
one
there's one or
person.
two people.
Then like the one
That's
person's like,
it.
oh, wait a second.
Yeah, I know. It's like, oh, what's
maybe
that?
I.
But that's it. So when you start giving adequate health care to a medically neglected population, you will see things you didn't see before. There was a clinic in Southern California who I did a talk to, a PrEP talk, and they're an AIDS service organization that started offering PrEP.
Okay.
And one of their complaints was, yeah, we're doing PrEP, but now we're seeing all these STIs. Oh my God, this is out of control. All the syphilis, all the gonorrhea.
Yeah.
And I said to them and their staff, okay, so you've had like maybe 400, you've diagnosed 400 gonorrhea cases this year. Well, how many HIV negative men did you ever test for gonorrhea before you ever started offering PrEP? Zero. So when you start asking the questions, you start getting the answers. And that is what, so it is safe to say, and it would be accurate to say, that in this way I'm describing it, PrEP can be correlated with higher levels of STIs because of the testing and the treating and the documenting involved.
But it's not
But it's not caused by PrEP.
Yeah, it's not what you think. It's not because PrEP is like making people go out and, you know, get gonorrhea and everything like that. It's more like, hey, we're finding out because people are coming in for it. We're finding out now that people might have this and we're treating it. We're taking care of it. It's a whole different animal. So it's almost like how you look at it, because there are going to be people, unfortunately, who look at it like, oh, well, yeah, they're testing, but all these people have this and, you know, it's causing it. It's definitely causing it. And then there are other people who I think look at it rationally and are like, oh, they're coming in, they're getting treated for it. So that's a good thing that they get treated for it.
And I mean, okay, so let's say you and I go to the same party, and if we're in this really big orgy together,
okay, all right.
After this,
all right.
I go to see my doctor. No. We're gonna bring Truett. We're gonna bring TT. So I'm gonna see my doctor over 4 times in the next year, and over those 4 times, I may get tested and treated for anal gonorrhea, and that might be more than once. But if you're never seeing your doctor or you're never being offered anal swabs, you are still going to be a carrier and transmitter of gonorrhea, but never get recorded on paper.
Yeah.
And to further add to the data here, LabCorp in New York State reported between 2013 and 2015, they reported a 160% increase in anal swabs. So that's good, right? I mean, that is really, really good. That's all good news. The outcome of all of that is that you're actually offering really good health care and adequate testing, treating to a neglected population. But then it will be correlated. But let's remember, if you don't remember anything else, if everyone's blanking out, wake up right now to remember this.
Wake up, guys.
Wake up. Correlation is not causation. Correlation is not causation. And that's where the media and that's where these myths often get twisted, is when they confuse correlation with causation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll give you another example. I used to get, and this is not unusual, what I'm going to tell you, I used to get sick kind of regularly. Like in the winter, I'd get a really nasty cold. In the summer, I'd get a really nasty cold. Nothing severe, but it would keep, it'd be enough to keep me up worrying about HIV, and sometimes miss a few days of work. Ever since I started using Truvada, I don't get sick. I don't get sick. And I run this group on Facebook where we talk about PrEP every day. And a lot of people are saying, when I started using Truvada, I stopped getting sick. I stopped getting little colds. Now,
is that a stress thing?
Well, so is that because Truvada caused health? Metabolically, no. There'd be absolutely no reason to say that. But it's correlated with less anxiety. It's correlated with less stress. And when we're less anxious and less stressed, our immune systems are stronger. But see, that's where I could make a causation that would be inaccurate. And saying that Truvada prevents the common cold would be just as inaccurate as saying Truvada causes higher rates of gonorrhea and syphilis and chlamydia.
Yeah. Less anxiety, less stress, I think, helps everybody.
Yeah.
Regardless of the situation.
And it helps our immune system. So if we're in contact with those nasty winter colds here in New York City, our immune system is stronger because we're not as worried and distracted about that everlasting cloud of fear of HIV.